I think that there's some people that can probably be restored, but it's got to be a long, a diligent, and a thorough process. There's got to be a good bit of humility.
Hi, I'm Carl Vaders, and welcome to the Church Lobby, conversations on faith and ministry, and to our continuing series within a series about desizing the church. My guest for this episode is Matt Steen, and we're talking today about, are we too quick to re-platform fallen pastors? Matt is the co-founder of Chemistry Staffing. It's a ministry that helps churches find great staff members and staff members find awesome churches. So this is the first of three first reaction episodes that we're doing to close out this desizing series with. In these three episodes, I'll be talking with people who read advanced copies of the book, and I'll get their first reactions to it. Now, for Matt, as someone who helps match pastors with the right church, I wanted to get his reaction to what I wrote in Desizing the Church about what is the right time to re-platform pastors after they've failed morally, including the fact that we often rush to re-platform them when their gifts are bigger than their integrity is. We also address the idea that a restoration to ministry may mean never re-platforming some pastors at all. Plus, we also address the dangers of re-victimizing those who have been hurt when we aren't careful to do this well. Don't forget to stick around when the interview is done. I'll come back with some important final thoughts about what Matt calls platform addiction, as well as I'll address three essential questions that must be asked if you're ever in a position to re-platform a pastor, or if you're a pastor who's considering being re-platformed yourself. Matt Steen, thanks for being on the podcast again.
Carl, it is so good to be here. I'm excited for this, I think.
Thank you. Yeah, we're getting these first responses from the book, and you were one of the ones who got a very early first response because you're one of the ones that I sent an early copy to, and you wrote a very kind endorsement for the book, so people can actually read that endorsement when they pick up Desizing the Church. But you work for Chemistry Staffing, so remind us again, who and what is Chemistry Staffing, and what do you do?
Well, what we do, quite frankly, is we help churches find pastors. That's what it comes down to. We come alongside a church, we manage the search process for them. We help them find somebody that's going to be there for the long term. And,
Got it.
5 years or more. So
okay. So you put pastors on platforms.
Oh boy. I feel like I'm being accused of something here, Carl.
So no, there's no accusations here whatsoever. We need the right pastors put in the right places, and being on the platform is a part of that. But I know you well enough to know that the platform is not the only, and in many churches, not even the primary place of ministry for a lot of pastors. But I wanted to talk to you. I threw this at you, and you're like, okay, we'll give this a shot because I'm heading right into your territory. But I'm going to be asking questions about you that, yeah, you might have some interesting insight into this because of what you do. But you're also going to try not to get in trouble. Right.
Well, my wife will tell you I'm not very good at that. So this could be a great conversation.
Which I know as well, which is why this is one of the things I wanted to talk to you about. So we got the chap about platform near the end of the book, and there's a segment particularly near the end of the chapter that I want to talk to you about, because one of the things that I get into in the book is when we have had a problem where the church has not been desizing, and where we've emphasized the wrong things, we now have a whole bunch of people who are hurt because of this. Sometimes you've got pastors who have caused damage to their own selves, and out of that have then caused damage to the congregation. And then we have this thing in the church, and I think, in fact, I'm pretty sure it's because we are people of grace. And so restoration is a huge part of who we are and who we are supposed to be. But when that spills over into re-platforming before proper discipline is done or proper restoration has been done, then we get a re-victimization, often on both sides. We often re-victimize the pastor who we put on a platform too early,
Yeah.
and we
Yeah.
re-victimize the congregation that they're there. So one of my segments I call "Be Quick to Restore and Not to Re-Platform." Talk
Absolutely.
about some of that from your perspective, and especially given what you do, which is trying to connect the right pastor with the right congregation.
Yeah, and this is a tricky one, right? Because I mean, the names come to mind of guys that never really went through restoration, decided to go out and plant another church or got replatformed way too quick. And we know the
Mhm.
names, we know the stories there. I am going to give you an unpopular take on this because I think you're right. I think we tend to be a little bit too gracious. I almost wonder if we don't default to no and then work towards potentially yes. If there's a moral fail, if there's a spectacular failure of integrity or something like that, I think the default is probably not going to be back on the platform. But I'm not God, I'm not the Holy Spirit. And so there's a potential for somebody to be restored, but it's going to be a really high bar. The way I kind of look at it, and I think you touched on it. I think the line that you used that really was painful, if I'm honest, is we have this platform addiction
Mhm.
and we don't put somebody in recovery. We're not kind of dragging them into a bar or something like that. Sometimes if we have somebody who goes down a road that because of the platform that they've been put on has a spectacular failure, I think we need to be wise about putting them back into a similar situation where that's going to hurt them. I think that there's some people that can probably be restored, but it's got to be a long, a diligent, and a thorough process. There's got to be a good bit of humility. There's got to be a lot of clear, honest, and uncomfortable repentance. And there needs to be, just a sense that, what, I am okay with not being in the middle of everything. If somebody comes to me and says, you know what, this is what I used to do, but if I'm happy just to go be a greeter and
Yeah,
and serve
yeah.
that way, that says something to me. There's a guy that I met years ago. He got caught up into this, and it's kind of a sad story because he started at a church in Northern Virginia where the church was probably like 200 when he got there. Next thing you know, it's 3,000. He's a flaming introvert, not wired for the extroversion thing, but was, the crowds kept coming and he had to be an
Mhm.
extrovert up front. And then he also had to go do all the visitation and everything because pastors got to do that, right?
Mhm.
And that growth that, I mean, just I think he had a brownout. I think he just kind of had not a full blackout, but just kind of one of
Right.
those things where just kind of in that state where so outside of who he was, so outside of his wiring, didn't have the support around him that he needed, had a moral fail, blew up his marriage, ended up marrying his secretary. And this is years after talking to him, the repentance and the humility and the heart there that says, man, I really messed up. I had a calling and it was heartbreaking for me. But he's a guy that I might say, you know what? Maybe,
Mhm.
maybe we can replatform him because I think he's done the work. I think he's genuinely repented. I know he's going back to his church and in front of the entire congregation said, I am sorry. I
Yeah.
failed you. And you don't hear those stories, but I kind of think we need to get to the point where that's what has to happen before we get to that. I think there also needs to be a piece of this within ourselves where I recognize, hey, I have failed, and that may mean I am disqualified. And if I'm disqualified for forever, I'm not the one to contradict that. Now that
Yeah.
takes, that's tough, but
Yeah.
I know we interviewed a guy that actually I would have been okay with restoring him, Carl. He had gone through a restoration process. Everybody I talked to said, yeah, he's done the work. The unfortunate thing is he's never going to get replatformed. And the reason is there's a couple of people that every time they catch wind that he is getting close in a church, they start making a big fuss of it. They start
Mhm.
calling the church. And you
Yeah.
know what? That's unfortunate on the part of those people, but that's part of what goes with sin.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's one of those things that, what, for the good of the congregation, for the good of the victims and the people that are caught up in it, you may need to sacrifice that calling and that gifting that you have.
Yeah. Yeah. It almost sounds at times like where you want to go, that's not necessarily cancellation, that's consequence.
That's consequence. Yeah. we're quick to say cancellation, but it is consequence of sin. Adam and Eve, they sinned. God still loved them. God still let them do great
Yeah.
things, but there were definite consequences on the other side of that.
And now a short break to talk about something else. If you like the content you're hearing, here are two things you can do for us. First, forward this podcast to a friend. Second, consider becoming a financial supporter through Patreon, Venmo, or PayPal. Just go to carlvaders.com/support. For as little as $3 a month, you can help us put these resources into the hands of the ministries that need them the most. Our support link is in the show notes. Yeah, as we're talking about this, here's part of what I wonder. If we're so enamored with the idolatry of the platform that it is universally considered that if a person was on a platform and that was from where they had their fall, that if they're never on the platform again, that this is a demotion. When in fact, in maybe a whole lot of cases, not being on the platform isn't a punishment, it's a protection.
It's a protection. It's a way of pastoral care. It's honestly, it's kind of getting priorities in the right spot, right?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
had a really cool conversation with a guy, one of my favorite pastors. He's been at this church for 18 months. It's doubled in size. They had,
Wow.
450 people come out for Easter. The week after that was Depression Week when, they
Yeah.
cut in half again, right? But I mean,
Sure. But it
everything in the
happened.
eyes of the world. Yeah,
Yeah.
everything in the eyes of the world, up and to the right. And I asked him, I said, how are you keeping yourself from getting cocky? Because, the church is excited. They're cheering him on. They're like, this is the greatest thing ever. And he's like, yeah, they come once for the preaching, but that's not why they stay. And the more important stuff is going on in our groups, and the more important stuff is going on with our kids ministry. And I'm just, anybody can go up and preach.
Yeah.
And it's like, that's a really healthy, and it's not one of those faux humility things. This dude believes that he's got good people around him, kind of speaking into his ear and saying, hey, look, I'm there, but for the grace of God. But I think he's got that healthy enough perspective to say, yeah, you know what? I'm a bit piece of this. I'm not the show. In
Right.
fact, nothing that goes on Sunday morning is the show. The show is really what happens in people's living rooms and over coffee, tables, and the conversations and the discipleship that's going on there. And I think that's pretty healthy. I think if we can get back to
Yeah,
that,
that's
that's good.
great. How do we start engendering that in more of the church world? Because we do have the physicality of the stage. It's higher than the rest of the seats. It's lit. It's got microphones. You're introduced with music. Everything about it is the narcissist's dream, and yet there are still times when you have to speak to a large group of people, and that requires you being
Totally.
seen and you being heard. So, how do we do that in a healthier way so that we're not making it a haven for narcissists and then excusing their narcissism?
Yeah. Okay. So I think there's a few things. I think on the local level, I think there's a piece that you talked about the forest and the young trees dying.
Yeah,
Oh,
for those who haven't read the book, let me
yeah.
bring everybody up to speed on that. There's a forest in Oregon called Pando, and it's like 17,000 trees. But in fact, they've discovered it is actually the largest growing organism on Earth. It is actually a single tree that is coming up in 17,000 different places. And right now, you've got some very tall branches, but the forest is dying because the tall branches are overwhelming the saplings and the new growth isn't allowed to occur. And that's some of what happens in the church when we elevate the tall stalks and we forget about the small ones. So that's the
Yeah.
illustration you're referring to. So now I'll go from there.
So I think there's a systemic issue that we gotta figure out, right? And I think that the church industrial complex, or that's kind of the ministry industrial
Mhm.
complex out there, that is putting people out on the book tours, that's putting people up on stages, that's highlighting. I remember going to a church planning conference where the headliner was a guy that's leading a church of 10,000, and it's like, why are we putting that up there as the be all end all? What if
Mhm.
we have more people that we are inviting into the conversation that are coming from a smaller church, that are coming from a more normal sized church, and having them speak into health instead of making it, so number
Yeah.
driven. The biggest heartbreak of my job is interviewing guys who have incredibly successful ministry, but think they're a failure because all the books say if you're not growing, you're dying or whatever, right?
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
I think there's a cultural piece to that where we need to rethink, and that's why I love your book. We really need to rethink that, right? But I think there's also a piece for us in the local church where we need to get away from excusing things, both in ourselves, but also in our church leadership. I cringe a little bit internally when I hear people say, well, that's just pastor. And sometimes he's just handsy, or he forgets to put the money. I mean,
Mhm.
those are
Yeah.
extreme
Yeah.
examples,
Yeah.
right? But sometimes we let that go. But we also do this with ourselves. One of my pastors used to talk about how our lives hinge on these 2 to 4 second windows where we make snap decisions. And I think one of the things that happens when we start to get into an unhealthy rhythm and unhealthy rut is in those 2 to 4 second windows where we have to make a snap decision about whether to do something or not. Sometimes we allow a little bit of justification to creep in. It says, well, I do so much for the church. I'm working so much. I spend so much time doing this. I'm doing that, and we allow those justifications to creep in. We've got to catch those on ourselves. We need to have
Yeah.
people in our lives that are speaking into that to kind of to end that and cut that off early on enough so that we don't continue down a pathway of unhealth that gets us to a point where we're so fried we're making bad decisions up front and then having to be restored or
Yeah.
getting so focused on things that aren't important.
Yeah, that snap decision thought that you brought up, I think is really important because it's really easy for us to justify and think, well, I can do the numbers over here and I can be working really hard at getting the numbers up, but I can also over here stop myself when before it gets too much. I'm not going to go overboard on it. But just the nature of the way our brains function and the way our schedules work, if you're
Yeah.
spending most of your time in get the numbers up mode, then your snap decisions are going to
Be
gravitate
about
and default to that.
yeah,
And then the next thing you
totally.
know, you've made a decision in the spur of the moment that is now permanent or that you are going to have to backtrack on. And then, well, it's embarrassing to backtrack, so we'll keep going with it. And that's part of the danger of the numbers obsession is that it really does become the go-to rather than character being the go-to.
That's exactly it. The thing is, right? When was the last time that you heard the machine kind of championing the integrity and the character of somebody as opposed to
Mm.
and you're an author, part of the reason why I wrote a comment in the front of the book is because that's the quickest way for me to get published. Um, you know, I I don't have enough of the following and all
I
that
hear
kind of
you.
stuff
Yeah.
to do it. And I just, I
Hmm.
don't necessarily want to play the game, but I go to conferences, I'll go to these things, and it's like I'll come away from it and I just kind of have one of those sad sighs because it's so much of it is numbers, growth, big spectacle, all that kind of stuff. And then I think of guys like Lloyd, who you've never heard, you've never met Lloyd. You've never
Hmm.
heard of him. He's a guy that's been at the same church for 20 years in Sioux City, Iowa, and has done faithful ministry, has shaped lives, has poured into people, has cried with families, and has just done amazing work. And nobody's ever going to champion him in the same way as we see, but that dude does flat out ministry, and he
Yeah.
has changed lives, and he has done really, really cool work. Those are the guys that give me hope. He's got a healthy balance. He knows, we're never going to be a mega church. We don't need to be.
Yeah.
We're just going to do the good work that God has put on us and keep our heads down and let him figure it out. And we need to champion those guys more than some
That
of what the machine does.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. And I can't think of a better way to conclude this
Yeah.
interview than by celebrating the Lloyds out there who are doing consistent, faithful ministry completely under the radar. That's, in fact, how I end the book. I use C.S. Lewis's illustration of the woman who's most famous in heaven is someone no one ever heard about on earth.
Mhm.
Uh,
That's it.
and
That's it.
I'm convinced that's the way it's going to work out in the end. So we might as well start working that way now.
That's exactly it, man. That's exactly it.
Yeah. Beautiful. Thank you, Matt. Sure appreciate your time today.
Anytime. Thanks, Carl.
Well, Matt used the term platform addiction, and this is what I want us to recall and focus on before we end this episode. When we're obsessed with numbers in the church, we get obsessed with platforms, and especially with people who can use the platform to reach bigger crowds. Then we start to think that if we keep someone off the platform, well, we're punishing them. But often we're doing more harm than good when we re-platform them. So here are 3 principles that everyone needs to consider if you're ever in a position to decide whether someone should be re-platformed or permanently de-platformed. This is a hard question to ask, it's a hard decision to make, and this is not a definitive list, but I believe it's a good place to start. Question number 1 has to be this: is the possible re-platforming about the numbers that they can bring in, or is it because it's truly the best type of ministry for this particular minister to have? If it's just about the numbers, then you have to discount that and it can't be considered at all. But if it's truly the best ministry, if it's the place where God is really calling them and where they can really be used the best, then that's where they ought to be. But I'm thinking in most situations, we rush to the platform and we shouldn't, and many would be better off in a ministry place that isn't on the platform. Secondly, ask this question: who will be damaged if they're not deplatformed completely, compared to who will be damaged if they are replatformed? Think about that. Quite often we think that we need to replatform someone because, well, the person who's being deplatformed is feeling bad about it and is feeling punished by it. But quite often the only person who's really being hurt is the person who committed the offense to begin with, and maybe a handful of their closest friends and fans, and that's about it. Meanwhile, if we re-platform them, you may have an entire church or a whole bunch of people who will be re-victimized again by putting a person on a platform after they caused damage on the platform to begin with. So ask, who will really be damaged given the decision that you're going to make? And then the third question to ask is this: was the reason for them being deplatformed because of habitual behavior on their behalf? Or was it a one-time error that everybody universally acknowledges is completely out of character for them? If this is a one-time issue and they've truly repented and they've truly been restored, and it is pretty much universally acknowledged that this is not going to be repeated, then it's something to consider. But if people are looking around and going, well, I guess we should have seen this coming, or that's just who they are, or that's just the way that pastor is, they're just kind of that, this kind of habitual behavior, yes, can be repented of. Yes, can absolutely be forgiven. But no, it's really dangerous to put someone back in a position where there will be triggers that will reignite those habits. Don't put the alcoholic in charge of the bar. Don't put the egotist back on a platform. If this platform has proven dangerous not just to victims but to themselves, it will re-victimize them, it will re-victimize others, and they need to be kept off the platform for everybody's health and safety. In the next episode, I'm coming in with a First Reactions interview with Mike Rubino. Mike is a pastor, he's a teacher, and he's a straight-talking Long Islander, and we had a great conversation about the danger of idolizing outcomes from the first chapter of Desizing the Church. We'll have a conversation that includes how to hold goals loosely and some of the right and wrong ways to use church metrics. This episode was produced by Veronica Beaver. It was edited by Phil Vaders. Original theme music was written and performed by Jack Wilkins of jackwilkinsmusic.com. The graphic design is by Solomon Joy. And me, I'm Carl Vaders, and I hope to talk with you again in the church lobby.